Hello everyone, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation to present in this conference. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this recording is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders and families. I have entitled this presentation Translanguaging in Education for What? In order to dive into this term that has been receiving a lot of attention over the last decade in language education, sometimes with very particular meanings and purposes, and other times, and I would say the majority of times, without a clear understanding of the term. And I'm not surprised by this confusion. In a recent commentary by the Center of Applied Linguistics, as you see here, they pinpoint the many ways in which translanguaging has been talked about in the literature. And Jasper also comments that it can apply to an innate instinct that includes monolinguals, performance of fluid language use that pertains to bilinguals, a bilingual pedagogy or a theory or approach of language, or a process of personal and social transformation. So in concurring with Jasper's sentiment that this is a lot for one term, Cummins states that the term carries extraneous conceptual baggage. Some years ago, Matsuda pointed out the popularity in taking up the term translingual writing in writing programs across the US. He discusses the various effects the introduction of a term has for people in the field. He states that for some, there is the desire to use the new and exciting notion, the frustration of not fully understanding what it looks like or how it works, and even the fear that the new ideas are going to push them out of their comfort zone. Understanding the important intellectual movement behind this practice called translingual writing, Matsuda very rightly points out that inflating a term and concept has serious consequences. The term can lose its descriptive and explanatory power, leading to the trivialization and eventual dismissal of the concept. So we don't want this to happen to translanguaging, which means it is important for us to think through and review its intellectual and transformative value. And being clear about the perspective is, in fact, the very first thing that translanguaging scholars will ask you to do when thinking about translanguaging in relation to pedagogy. That is, the need to be clear about the stance, the ideological system beliefs that informs teachers' approaches to teaching immersion bilinguals, which I think seems reasonable, as I can't imagine how any meaningful design and shifting work can happen if teachers aren't clear about what the educational philosophy of the terms they are taking up are rooted or grounded in. Of course, different scholars may have different underlying beliefs, but for the purposes of this talk, I will centralize the ideas focusing on Ofelia Garcia and others she writes with, as I understand them to be the key pioneers in introducing this term to educational linguistics. Okay, so let's begin with what translanguaging is by starting with its conceptualization of bi- or multilingual language use. And I'll borrow an image used in one of Kate Seltzer's presentation recently. So the traditional view of bilingualism is characterized as languages as separate, discrete, and bounded groups of features, so separate linguistic systems. And in such a system, people code switch. They switch in and out of separate languages. And so when we think about the multilingual, we may think that they are two monolinguals in one body. In the current view, which is characterized by many different and perhaps subversive prefixes, such as pluri, trans, poly, and metro, the understanding is even if there is an external perspective out there in the world where different languages exist, in the internal life of multilingual speakers, they are all just one complex and dynamic linguistic system. So F is for the features of the speaker's linguistic repertoire here, and N stands for nominal number. So under this view, we all have our own special mix of languages and self-expression. In other words, we each have our own idiolect. So we are all native speakers of our own idiolect, and we belong wherever we feel belonging. Whereas in this other view, some consequences may be that speakers can be socialized into harmful ideologies that can lead to feelings of being an illegitimate speaker and develop other oppressive emotions such as shame and fear that shape the identities and lives of speakers, which was actually my own multilingual experience. So generally speaking, we might say that this way of thinking, or this starting point, opens up more possibilities for multilingual speakers, since speakers are not trapped by pre-existing categories, borders, or boundaries. One has one's own way of being, thinking, knowing, understanding, and the goal is to develop these repertoires. So from a translanguaging perspective, even if they recognize that languages do have an important sociocultural reality in the lives of speakers, their focus is not on this external view, but on the ways in which multilinguals use their language resources. And if languages do not have any linguistic reality, then it is not a thing, an object, or an entity. We do not have something called languages, and all the categories that like to box language up aren't useful either. So classifications like L1, L2 also don't make much sense, and we do not go across or transfer from one language to another, since they do not exist in those bounded ways. So translanguaging zooms in on the process, the doing, the ing. It sees language as a practice, an act that we engage in, and thus dynamic because our communicative practices are contingent and not scripted. Our various meaning-making resources exist in one unitary semiotic repertoire, and we select language features according to the context we are performing in. So the trans in translanguaging thinks about language practices as transcending, that is to go beyond, and thus it is focused on the emergent and rejects ways of talking about the creativity of multilingual language practices as being contained in rigid, pre-packaged boxes of languages, such as switching in and out of languages. The languaging aspect of translanguaging, which I attribute mostly to Meryl Swain's work in the early 2000s, is complementary to the ways in which translanguaging is understood. In the first instance, the focus in languaging is on our capacity to make meaning. So as you see here, the notion focuses on the use of resources in the process of meaning making, not the language structure per se. So this will include all kinds of semiotics, such as images, gestures, our senses, etc., since we rarely ever just use language to make meaning. The goal is to broaden students' meaning-making repertoires and to use the new features confidently to do what they want to do. So for teachers, this means we create learning tasks and activities that enable students to work together to solve problems and negotiate meaning. So in this regard, if we bring the trans, that notion of the dynamic and emergent, together with the languaging that focuses on each individual speaker's processes of meaning making, then we are talking about the fluid use of everything we have, that is our existing knowledge and skills, to make meaning in ways that make sense to us. More recent publications in translanguaging go beyond this idea of fluid meaning making. As we see here, there is an awareness that any depoliticized approach to multilingualism lacking an explicit social justice perspective will contribute to the production of neoliberal subjects in ways that exacerbate existing global racial and class inequities. So social justice, as in everyone deserving equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities, has, I think, always been at the heart of translanguaging, but it is much more pronounced in the recent literature. So in the current notion of trans in translanguaging, in relation to education and social justice for racialized and language minoritized students, two ideas come to mind: the transcending of social, cultural, and geographical boundaries that dichotomize, like native speaker or non-native speaker, standard or non-standard language, first or second language, academic or non-academic language. And the second notion is transgression, to push against existing relations of linguistic and political powers. And of course, the US has a long history of such notions for transgression in education as a practice of freedom from many of the Black feminist activists' work, such as Bell Hooks and others who have created culturally responsive pedagogies. However, in our increasingly divided and divisive world, actions and treatments such as paternalism and oppression are shared and intensifying around the world, as we see in the news every day. We see bias, racism, and stereotyping get recreated and reified in schools. Writing about plurilingual learners and schooling, Margaret Hawkins states plurilingual students face social stigma, rejection, and often isolation, and can come to feel that they don't belong, that this is not a place for people like them. We see this role of schools very clearly in the literature on Aboriginal EAL students in Australian schools, for example, where Rubino discusses how schools accelerate the process of linguistic assimilation and there being increasing invisibility of Aboriginal students because of our misrecognitions or lack of understanding of Aboriginal language or Aboriginal English-speaking students. Issues of not belonging, exclusion, racism, and othering are rife in the literature on refugee background students in Australian schools also. Students themselves do have a desire to belong and a need to perform well at school. But as we can see here, in a wonderful meta-synthesis of the literature on Australian teachers and students' beliefs and attitudes towards language, mostly over the last 10 years, that my student Florence McKay did very recently, English language learners in our context are filled with deficit language ideologies themselves, which have been shaped by multiple discourses and practices in many different but interrelated spheres of their educational socialization. The literature also shows our teachers carry a range of monoglossic ideologies of language purity and appropriacy, and these too are shaped by multiple forces within their teaching life. And so much of these unhelpful and damaging consequences in language education stems from policies and practices that have the explicit goal of creating a monocultural and monolingual society. Monolingualism has a genesis in colonialism that has at its heart linguistic homogeneity, that understands all of us share a single common national language and culture, that we have one language only, which can lead to policies like English-only policies, that we must restrict language used to one language at a time, and practices to keep languages separate. And such underpinnings would see the mixing of languages as leading to contamination and deficit views of minority or migrant background students. The quotes here are a collection from secondary teachers who have seen other teachers talk about English language learners in deficit ways. Where do these ideas come from? Often, they can be traced back to the monolingual mindsets I described earlier. They do have real effects in schools. In the now hundreds of narratives, anecdotes, and interviews I have read and conducted myself with a range of plurilingual students, I can confidently say students do know and feel they are being seen in these ways. They don't feel they have the power nor the language to respond, so they either see the fault within themselves, i.e., that their English is not good enough, or they simply disconnect, believing this is not a world for them. So at the heart of translanguaging, and this doesn't matter which scholar you are reading and which region they're coming from, one thing does remain. They are all working towards equity, and that is in creating the conditions in which everyone can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. In transcending inequities, translanguaging positions itself as a political act that has not just advocacy, but activism, empowerment, transformation in mind. And to do so, there is a strong emphasis on decolonizing the practice of domination. In a decolonizing framework, pedagogies would be shaped by acts of disrupting, challenging, questioning, and transforming. We will need to undo and reconfigure with equal access and equity in mind. And some entry points of this undoing may be in embracing complexity, starting from the internal, collaborating, listening, and learning from each other. In an incredibly creative and meaningful project two of my Japanese exchange students did some years ago, while they traveled to Australia wanting to engage with the world but being too afraid to do so because of certain fears that they had developed in performing linguistically, I learned that they did want to join new communities and participate in new cultural practices, but they wanted to do these things without having to be anyone other than themselves. Their goal wasn't to speak like a native speaker, nor be integrated into some national culture, and they weren't interested in being measured against other people's standards. They wanted to be free from everyone else's expectations and to be free to explore who they could be, drawing on their own ways of learning, knowing, and being in the world. In short, they just wanted to be somebody in the world, someone they themselves see as special. But you cannot do that if you are entering every new space and practice with deficit thinking happening inside of you. And as I showed you earlier with the deficit thinking being reflected in teachers' comments about language minoritized students, we can already see the uneven playing field that multilingual students have to learn in. Whatever they do, they are still seen as inferior. So how can they negotiate a voice, their meaning, when the roads are blocked? So you increase your capacity to engage not as a second or foreign language speaker or even a dual language speaker. You cannot become somebody unless you can engage with others as yourself. And to do that, you need to develop your own voice, something I do not see a lot of in all sectors of education these days, that is heavily skills-based. Such developments can't happen if we're simply just thinking about translanguaging as a scaffold to learning English, or if home languages are viewed only as a stepping stone until they master English. A translanguaging approach underpinned by a transformative stance means we need to build relationships with our students, which entails getting to know who our students are and the ideologies that have shaped their language practices. And they're not going to give us such deep insights, are they, if we don't shift our power relations? So translanguaging gives us an opportunity to open up important discussions on how we think about language and equity in education, but one has to learn about its underpinnings. With any approach, my first inclination is to think about what the ideological set of beliefs are, why and where I see the approach as useful, and I would do a critical reflection of how my views have been shaped and whether these make sense in relation to the students I am teaching. In implementing any task or activity with translanguaging in mind, the questions I tend to reflect on are things like, how do my tasks or activities help students learn about the effects of language on their lives, others, and the world? Or how do my tasks or activities help us understand the intersections of language, power, equity, and anti-oppression? So schools do need to make space for teachers to critically reflect on their decisions for teaching and learning with experts, and they need to stop expecting that teachers should do yet another thing in their own time. While there are many interconnected spheres of life we must consider when we are talking about transformations in schools, we should never forget, as Kathleen Hughes suggests here, promising change comes from below, from teachers in the classrooms. A great starting point is to see multilingualism as the norm, a natural way of life, if we are going to break the stubborn deficit views of linguistic diversity held in schools, in teachers' and students' bodies, so that we can create the best learning opportunities for all children, then we need to get serious about recognizing the intersections and interconnectedness of language and all of these other dimensions that are inseparable from language and literacy. And of course, these lines are also not so clear and distinct anymore either. Finally, I believe in a togetherness, which is described by translanguaging scholars as juntos, that can allow us to disrupt, negotiate, and reconfigure ways we think about language diversity. In the panel Transformative Relations of Power that follows, I think you will see what enormous possibilities and also challenges are involved as we work together, pushing back against dominant policies and discourses in our own subtle ways, and just doing our own thing. In my collaborations with this new generation of teachers and scholars, I've come to believe very strongly that our collaborative efforts in thinking with new words can help us think differently about the new worlds we seek to build in Juntos. Thank you everyone for your attention. Muchas gracias. 감사합니다.